World Philosophy Day.
World Philosophy.
World Philosophy Day.
World Philosophy.
World Philosophy.
World Philosophy.
Okay, so Professor Roger Ames, thank you very much for joining us today in this series of interviews with the Philosophy Department at ECNU to celebrate World Philosophy Day 2020. So as somebody who is so influential in getting to know the cultures of the world, past and present, and who can speak two of the most widely spoken languages of the world, you are obviously a great person to ask about the world. But philosophically speaking, how can we understand this word, world?
When I began my philosophical journey, Rory, in Hong Kong, as an 18-year-old, bright and bushy-tailed student, one of my first professors was this wonderful scholar, Lao Tse-guang. And he used to always say to me, Roger, 我们不要谈中国哲学，我们要谈世界哲学中的中国哲学. You know, that, and his idea was that philosophy is one thing, that the notion of inter and the notion of intra are very different. So within the discipline of philosophy itself, the world of philosophy is one thing. It's organically related. And so this idea of comparative philosophy, of using geographical criteria for distinguishing different traditions has never worked. Mm-hmm. One of my heroes is Li Ziho. Li Ziho is a Kantian. Li Ziho is a Marxist. Li Ziho is a Confucian. But if you were to use any of those labels to characterize him, he would say no. He would say, I'm Li Ziho. Because he sees himself as a philosopher.
As an undergraduate and up until today, I have learned about many philosophical perspectives from your teaching and publications. These include Chinese classical philosophy, mainly Taoism, systems theory, mainly that of Niklas Luhmann, Hegelian philosophy, and your own philosophical perspective. We might say that each of these contain a different view of the world, and I wonder if you could say something about the concept of world.
Thanks for the question, Rory, and thanks for the kind introduction. I think the concept of the world, first of all, is a good question, and it's also a timely question. In the context of what has been called globalization, right? That's, I mean, if we were to name one of the major phenomena that characterizes recent decades or even the recent, let's say, 2 or 3 centuries, I think it would probably be the concept of globalization. And more precisely, going back to using Luhmann's term, who you mentioned briefly, we can also speak of world society nowadays, right? So that is different from the history of humankind. And that is very obvious in basically all the major social areas. That is like in the economy, right? We're living now in a world economy. Our economic reality is a world economic reality. It's equally obvious in the media, right? The media is like also equally like a global phenomenon. Even the academic system, right? Like the university are all interconnected. You graduate in China as an Irish person and you came from an Irish university and then you're going to go for a career somewhere in the world. And the publication system is equally like globally, right? So these are all these major social systems during the past few decades or during the past few centuries, they've globalized. So that was like I would say the number one drastic change that characterizes contemporary times compared to earlier times. Now, I'd like to mention one more thing that I think for me very clearly exemplifies world society, and that is world tourism, which Luhmann doesn't really talk about. And I think that this world tourism is specifically relevant for understanding actually what I think is like a core theoretical result of the understanding of world society, which makes actually the concept of the world, and this is what I'm trying to get at, or this is what I will be getting at, very different from the older concept of the world. I think that kind of paradoxically, globalization has made the older traditional concepts of the world, the pre-globalization concepts of the world, obsolete. So we're living in a time of globalization, but we're still operating with a concept of the world that predates globalization and that is outdated. So in the West, for instance, we have this notion of the world as somehow the one world, of this kind of the notion of cosmopolitanism, the world citizen. Like we have some form of world community, and even this idea of the World Philosophy Day is somehow informed by this old idea of the world, right? This one world which comes together as a community. And kind of even more outdated is what is now happening in China, that they're trying to revive this old concept of tianxia, right? And try to recommend it as a kind of a Chinese concept of the world that, and I think that's maybe even more hopelessly outdated than the Western concepts of the world. Now, the problem with the world, and then I'm trying to explain why this concept of the world that we're dealing with is kind of this pre-globalization concept is outdated. But the problem with the world under conditions of globalization is that it becomes very clear that the world as such cannot be seen. The world as such is too big, right? I see this world map behind you right now. And this world map, you know, it has the whole world on it, and some parts are green and some parts are kind of yellowish. But of course, if we go there, then it won't be green there. And in the yellow areas, if we go there, it won't be yellow, right? So what I'm trying to say is we only experience the world and can only experience the world in a virtual form, in a form of representation that never shows us the whole world. So that's a kind of a paradoxical element of the world under conditions of globalization, that we see the world everywhere, but we never see the world as such. We see the world in a specific form of representation, in a specific, let's say, systemic context that in the case of your world map is a certain geographical context. Mostly it's kind of a media context, it can be an economical context and whatsoever. So we basically see the world always under conditions, that's a Luhmannian term, under conditions of second order observation, never as first order observation, right? Under conditions of globalization, we never look at the world directly, but we look at somewhat similar to the world map in your background in a specific way as it is observed from a specific perspective with a specific, under the condition of specific representations. And this brings me back to this when I reflected on the question, I think that's maybe the best example, world tourism. So when people want to see the world, right? That was like the traditional idea along with this traditional concept of the world. What do you do if you want to see the world? You become a tourist, right? That's what the aim of, but then of course, tourism itself has become also entirely a second order observation system, in the sense that it built up a totally new infrastructure that didn't exist before tourism, right? And so what you see is basically the touristic infrastructure, the world as it is staged, as it is reproduced for the system of tourism. And basically everything what you see on your trip is part of this tourism, from the moment you get onto the plane, and when you get into the hotel or the youth or the hostel, and then you go into the restaurants which cater the tourists and so forth. And so there's a whole industry, and that exemplifies how we see the world under conditions of second order observation. Right? We see a world that is specifically staged. There's a whole infrastructure that produces the world so that it can be observed from a specific constructed observation perspective. And the same thing is true, as I said, for the media. The same thing is even true for academics. So this is like it's basically a form of a virtual, of a virtualization of the world. And I think that really is elementary for the concept of the world under conditions of globalization. It's a kind of a staged world. And there's this one quote from Luhmann that he says, the observation of observers has become the advanced mode of perceiving the world in modern society, right? So just as in tourism, we observe the way that tourism observes the world, right? The tourism system is already an observation system, just like the media system, that we then somehow enter. So we observe the world through the observations of the tourism infrastructure. So we basically observe how tourism observes the world. And this has become the advanced mode of perceiving the world in modern society in all systems. In all systems, in order to see the world, just like when we're looking at this map, we have to look at the observer who observes the world in a specific way, in a specific system. But of course, we never see the world. So this very notion of seeing number one, it is impossible to see the world, and number two, it wouldn't even be desirable, right? I mean, now you see the world behind me, right? There's no meaning for anyone, right? The world as such has no meaning and is boring, and nobody wants to see it or even can see it. And I think so that's we need to understand that the world, specifically under conditions of globalization, is too big to be perceived in first order observation. So that's again the conclusion. The very fact of globalization has perceived a concept of the world that is entirely based on second order observation. So globalization has brought about, one of the effects is the widespread replacement of first order observation through second order observation. And again, going back what I said at the beginning, the philosophical, the conceptual apparatus that we're using is still dates back to the pre-globalization time. So we still have this idea or this ideal that the world can somehow be addressed or understood or seen from a first order observation perspective, and that's entirely not the case.
So just our first question, how do you understand the meaning of the word world?
So I understand, I mean, the world is, it's a structural or categorical, term that we use. There is actually no furnitured object of reality that is the world, right? So it's a way in which we construct our experience, and maybe it's a healthy way of doing things, because it implies, at least to me, that we acknowledge there are many cultures, many philosophical traditions, and there's some way in which the philosopher should be engaging, all of those.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that just leads directly into my next question then. How would you understand the term world philosophy?
Yeah, I think maybe we're moving a little bit more toward the engagement of world philosophy and a little bit away from comparative philosophy. I think most of us who have been working in the area of comparative philosophy are now looking at a time that we would call maybe beyond comparative philosophy. Beyond just taking Chinese philosophy, let's say, as an example, and Western philosophy, and setting them alongside of each other. And now I think it's much more, if it was ever that kind of a thing, that kind of an enterprise, I think we're definitely moving beyond that now, so that we're learning from non-Western traditions. Non-Western philosophers are learning from and engaging Western philosophy. So I think what we're seeing with this like emergence of world philosophy or global philosophy or beyond comparative philosophy, I think what we're seeing is not so much yet a body of knowledge, but we're seeing the emergence of a different sort of philosopher. Mm-hmm. For example, those of you who are in graduate training right now at East China Normal, you're being trained to be a different sort of philosopher than I was. When I was trained in analytic philosophy and philosophy of language. I wrote my dissertation on Wittgenstein, and I didn't know anything about Chinese philosophy or African philosophy or Japanese Buddhism or the Kyoto School or any of that, right? So, but I think world philosophy, to me, doesn't mean a set body of knowledge or a body of philosophy. This is world philosophy's view of ontology. This is world philosophy's view of epistemology or of morality. It's not like some sort of container in which everything is going in. But I think what it means is the emergence of a different sort of philosopher, of a thinker, someone who can bend language, work in more than one language, appreciate text in more than one language, appreciate different cultures. And I think God knows we need that, not just in philosophy, but in everything else,
Professor Brook Ziporyn, thank you so much for joining us today in this series of interviews with the Philosophy Department at ECNU to celebrate World Philosophy Day 2020. There are many different ways of doing philosophy, and each of these can offer a different perspective on the world. Your work on the Zhuangzi, Guoxiang, Tiantai Buddhism, and Neo-Tiantai thought gives us several examples of this, including reflection on the very notions of perspective and world. So I was wondering if you could begin by discussing how you understand the word world.
Sure. Thank you. Nice to be here. It's an interesting question. I guess in the most naive way, I would take world to be some kind of a totalization in a way that would allow us to think not only of the world or one world or the whole world, but there's a sort of trope these days when we speak of possible worlds and multiple worlds. And I guess if I try to unpack what I think that means, would mean any given system of commensurability with its own set of consistent laws or principles, so that when I think about a world, I think of a set of particular events that can communicate with each other, that are sort of commensurable in the sense of exchangeable, comprehensible to one another. And so, you know, I'm not really sure what how the World Philosophy Day thing is conceived, but you know, there's some room for discussion about whether the idea of a world implies that there is sort of necessarily one world, right? Whatever the sort of largest system we might think of, sort of the all-inclusive conception of what exists intelligibly to us. But I'm always a little bit wary of that, in the sense that the sort of rules or the constraints or the assumptions or the universals that pertain, you know, there is a danger of them being construed in a sort of a limiting way. So in other words, the world can be intended as an inclusive concept, but implicitly, because of the way sort of the playing field is set up, it can sort of backfire into a sort of an exclusive one. So I see a certain ambiguity in the term, right? It's sort of an attempted way of talking about not constrained to just local interests, but the whole world, but at the same time, you know, bringing with it a certain warranting some caution in its application. Yeah.
Okay. So, and you said you're not sure about the term world philosophy.
Well, World Philosophy Day, which is what you brought up, but yeah, I think you're right. World philosophy as well, I mean, is worth interrogating a little bit. Maybe is that that's the follow-up?
That is the
question.
Yeah.
So you mean what would I conceive world philosophy to be?
Yeah. How would you understand world philosophy?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, yeah, it does follow up on the previous point, I think. Obviously, there's I think a commendable intention there to make to widen the scope of what's done under the name of philosophy. So, you know, that would be the sort of surface meaning, not just Greek and European philosophy and sort of the big names from that canon, but embracing, you know, Indian and African, Chinese, Japanese philosophy and so on. And, you know, I'm all for that. But again, there's, you know, again, this sort of worry that, you know, even in the use of the term philosophy, there's an implicit tilting of, you know, not a matter of the content or the particular figures involved, but the criteria, the methodologies, even the goals of philosophy, kind of the rules that govern the discourse, right? So I would want maybe to think of world philosophy as a placeholder for a potential, you know, world's philosophy or world's philosophies. I always get a little worried by the singular or the plural, you know, it's the old one in many problem, you know. So, and even you're probably very aware, you know, that the way philosophy, as it's understood in sort of academia, works in a particular way. So what I wouldn't want world philosophy to turn out to be, maybe this is the short answer, I wouldn't want it to be an assimilation of all those sources to a conception of philosophy that derives from one of them. And there's some worry about that just because the word philosophy has its own history and, you know, it's fought over a little bit in some ways. So I don't think I myself use that term world philosophy, though I don't object to it, but it's always a problem what to call the kind of thing, I guess, you yourself and people like you and me do. What exactly is it? That's a good stand-in for the moment, but I find it a little bit problematic.
Okay, so Professor Yang Guorong, thank you very much for joining us today in this series of interviews with eminent scholars of philosophy to celebrate World Philosophy Day 2020. And it is hosted by the Philosophy Department at East China Normal University.
So I'm pleased to join your program.
Thank you very much. And as a scholar who has developed a deep understanding of Western philosophy and is also very influential in the interpretation of Chinese philosophy, as well as developing your own philosophical viewpoint. We have a lot to learn from you about the concept of world.
Okay.
And I wonder if you could say anything about that.
Right. So the concepts or the words of the world, it's as you say, it's quite broad. So they contains multiple meanings. So usually we maybe geography meaning go beyond the limitation of the nation or state, but for philosophy, it's maybe not focus on just limited on some kind of geography, the meaning. Instead, maybe we can focus on some kind of cultural background. So if we look at from this kind of perspective, maybe we can understand the world as some kind of philosophically go beyond some kind of different kind of tradition of philosophers. So as you know, before modern times, the philosophy in the world is developed in the different kind of area. Includes different kind of nation or states, such as we just speaking Chinese or India or some European country. But after the world entered into the world history, nearly now the situation changed. So this kind of separation go beyond. So different kind of philosophical tradition can meet together. So then the world, the meaning of the world also appears.
This is a very enlightening conception of world in philosophical terms. And it reminds me of how before, and still today, we often talk about Chinese philosophy, Western philosophy, and comparative philosophy. But this year, so Professor Yang Guorong, you're the president of the International Society for Chinese Philosophy, and next year ECNU will host the conference under the theme of world philosophy. So I wonder, could we say that this is maybe an emerging term, or how could we understand this term, world philosophy?
Yeah. So actually, the concept of world philosophy is appeared. This kind of expression appeared in the earlier 20th century. There's some philosophy like Husserl and Wang Yulan in modern times. They also include my tutor Feng Qi. They all of them talk about the world philosophy. So associated with what I said before about the concept of world. So world philosophy also we can look at from this kind of background. So by this kind of perspective, we may understand the world philosophy is something kind of the different kind of tradition of philosophy now became confused maybe together, and in contemporary especially the age or time. So and the maybe in deeper meaning of this kind emerging or merging together is so different kind philosophical tradition, really can dialogue together, and also we have some kind of condition and possibility to draw some kind of different kind of philosophical resources. Also, in some way, wisdom resources from different kind of background. So then we can establish a new kind of philosophical thinking.
At first, I want to ask you, philosophically, how do you understand the meaning of the word "word"?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different ways you can interpret this. So, of course, for many philosophers, when you talk about the world, we're talking, about something ontological, right? Or we could be talking about something metaphysical. For me, the area that, I wouldn't say that we, the way we should interpret this word, but the area that's I'm most concerned with is the social world. So the way that humans interact, and of course the way that humans interact with like animals and the planet as well. So I take the world to be mainly that, and I have a very sort of existential approach or interest in philosophy. So the world is also, what's sort of immediately around you. It's other aspects as well, but for me, those are the most interesting questions. Although I would never say that they should be the most interesting questions for other people. But, this is one good way to think about the world. It's basically the way that the World Congress of Philosophy was discussing the world, actually, in their previous conference, which was held in Beijing, and discussed how to be human, right? And so the World Congress was interested in basically this question, or you could say I'm interested in the same question as them. So for me, that's the world.
Okay. So how would you understand the term world philosophy? And how could we make philosophy a more global endeavor?
So, there's, again, if you ask this question, there's a couple different ways you can take it, right? So it's very popular in an academic sense to talk about world in terms of philosophies that draw on different cultures, or philosophies that draw on different traditions. For me, to talk about world philosophy, I, of course, think that this is very important, but I'm not someone who's really interested in diversity for diversity's sake. I'm interested in sharing ideas, right? You're from Bangladesh. I'm from America. We both, study in China. So I'm very interested in having diverse pools to draw on. But again, I don't think when we talk about the world, we necessarily have to be, when I think about world philosophy, I don't think we necessarily have to constantly be bringing up different perspectives. Sometimes it's really important to dive into one and to view the world, to really view the world in that way. So for example, I concentrate on Chinese philosophy. I don't do South American philosophy or Bangladeshi philosophy or Indian philosophy or African philosophy. But I think that it's important, academically, you can only really concentrate on one area, but then in dialogue and with conversations, to be open and to have a sort of honest exchange. I think that's really what it means to participate in world philosophy.
So, as a young scholar, you have translated some Chinese classical and modern works into English. And it's also pleasant to hear that as a non-native Chinese speaker, you are still teaching Chinese philosophy course in Chinese language to Chinese students as well as international students. So my final question is to you, how might philosophy help to promote multilingual connectivity and multicultural coexistence?
So I think that the translations that we've done, particularly the translation of the Tao Te Ching, really helps a lot with multilingual connectivity, because the way that we translated the Tao Te Ching was not to translate it into fluent or even really fluid English, but to do an almost character by word translation, which helps people to understand, if you're a young scholar of Chinese philosophy, then it will help you be able to read the classics. That was the goal. But it also really helps people understand classical Chinese thinking to whatever extent they can. And I think that's, when you talk about multilingual exchange, I think that's really, and even multicultural exchange, I think that's the most important thing, is to try to understand how other people think. And so the translations from the classics, that's the goal, is to do a sort of a really rough translation that requires a lot from the reader, but where the reader gets a lot. And then with the other translations, of course, they're much smoother, although I would still say that for the most part, the translation projects that I work on err on the side of being more literal and less fluid in English. So I hope that they contribute in that way to some multilingual and multicultural exchange. But I do think that, of course, books are important, but doing things like what ECNU does, right? Hosting international students and bringing students from China, from Bangladesh, from Ireland, from Ukraine, from North America, bringing them together in a classroom, I think probably does a lot more than any of the books that I've translated.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
No problem. Yeah.